Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of leadership.
Okay.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at Brené Brown's book, Dare to Lead.
Right.
Now, you guys have given us a pretty big stack of material to work with here.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah, we've got Amazon search results, we've got some articles, we've even got some foreign language editions of the book.
Yeah, and even workbooks and study guides.
Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of interest around this book.
Definitely a lot of buzz.
Yeah, a lot of buzz. So what do you think? What's got everyone so fascinated with this?
Well, I think it's really interesting, when you look at the sheer volume of resources that are out there.
Right.
It really does kind of point to the fact that people aren't just reading this book right. They're actually trying to apply it.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're going deeper.
Absolutely. And you highlighted a quote right on the Amazon page. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome. Now, I've heard this vulnerability thing before.
Yeah.
But, isn't there a risk that appearing vulnerable could backfire, especially when you're in a leadership position?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that gets to the heart of why Brown's work is so thought-provoking.
Yeah.
She's challenging those kind of traditional notions that we have about leadership.
Yeah.
Where being in charge means having all the answers.
Right.
And, always projecting this unwavering confidence.
Right. You got to be tough.
Yeah, exactly. And the reality is, we're all human.
Right.
Leaders are no exception.
Yeah. So you're saying that by trying to keep up this facade of always being in control, that could actually be detrimental.
Exactly. Because when leaders aren't willing to be open about their struggles,
yeah,
or admit that they don't have all the answers, it can create a culture of fear and distrust.
Right.
And so people are less likely to take risks or to share their own ideas.
Yeah.
If they think that that's going to be perceived as a weakness.
Makes sense. Okay, so I get that. But how does vulnerability actually, how does it play out in a leadership role?
Yeah.
I mean, it can't just be about, spilling your guts to your team every day, right?
Exactly right. It's not about oversharing. It's not about becoming emotionally dependent on your team or anything like that.
Right.
Brown emphasizes this idea of strategic vulnerability.
Okay.
So it's about being selective.
Yeah.
What you share and with whom.
Okay.
And it's more about, creating this culture where people feel safe to be themselves, to admit mistakes,
Right.
to ask for help.
So being a vulnerable leader is more about fostering that environment where everyone feels safe to be vulnerable themselves.
Precisely. And I think that's why we see all these workbooks and study guides.
Right.
It points to that desire to put these ideas into practice,
Yeah.
not just read about them passively.
Yeah. Yeah.
People are really hungry for this leadership style that feels more human,
Right.
more authentic.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because we also see the book being translated into so many different languages, Korean, Chinese, German.
Right.
So is this idea of vulnerable leadership something that resonates across cultures, or is it more of a Western thing?
That's a great question. And I think it speaks to the universality of the challenges that leaders face. I mean, whether you're in Seoul or Shanghai or Berlin, building trust, motivating teams,
Right.
navigating tough conversations. These are all common hurdles
For sure. Yeah,
that
absolutely.
we all face.
Yeah, no matter where you are.
Yeah.
So it seems like this need for a more authentic approach to leadership, it's pretty widespread.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at the sources you provided, and I'm noticing that Dare to Lead is often bundled with books like Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink,
Right.
which takes a very different approach, almost militaristic.
Yeah.
So why do you think these seemingly opposite leadership styles are often recommended together?
That's a great point. And I think it really highlights this idea that there's no one right way to lead,
Right.
Yeah. So pairing Brown's work with something like Extreme Ownership, maybe it's a way of saying, hey, look, leadership's multifaceted.
Yeah.
You need to understand different approaches.
Yeah.
Different tools for different situations.
Yeah, it's like having a diverse leadership toolkit.
Exactly.
You pull out the right approach for whatever challenge you're facing.
Right.
But let's get back to Brown's focus on vulnerability for a second.
Okay.
One of the critiques I've seen is that it could be difficult to apply in certain environments.
Yeah.
What about high-pressure, fast-paced industries where decisions need to be made quickly and decisively? Could vulnerability actually hinder effective leadership in those contexts?
Yeah, it's true that some industries have traditionally valued a more top-down command and control style.
Right. Yeah.
But even in those environments, I would argue that vulnerability can be a strength. So imagine a leader who's willing to acknowledge the limitations of their knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
who encourages their team to speak up when they see a potential problem.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that create a more agile and responsive organization?
Yeah, instead of just charging ahead, you're creating space for feedback.
Yeah, and remember, vulnerability is not about being indecisive.
Right.
It's about being open to input,
Okay.
building trust so that people feel empowered to contribute their best ideas.
So how would someone actually start to incorporate this idea of vulnerable leadership into their own style?
Mm-hmm.
What are some practical steps they could take?
Well, I think one of the most powerful things a leader can do is model the behavior they want to see from their team.
Okay.
So, start by being more open about your own challenges, your own mistakes.
Right.
Create a space where people feel safe to disagree or to express concerns.
So leading by example, but also, consciously creating that psychological safety.
Exactly. And it's not just about talk.
Right.
It's about action.
Yeah.
So when someone does speak up, actively listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
Show them that you value their voice, even if you ultimately make a different decision.
So showing that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's a strength that can actually lead to better outcomes.
Absolutely. And that takes courage.
Yeah.
It takes a willingness to challenge those old paradigms of what leadership should look like.
Which brings us right back to that highlighted quote.
Yeah.
Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome.
Right.
That really gets to the heart of Brown's message.
It does, and it's a message that seems to be resonating with people from all walks of life.
Yeah, and that's what strikes me about all these different editions of Dare to Lead.
Yeah.
It's not just CEOs and executives who are interested in this approach.
Right.
It seems to be resonating with people at all levels of leadership across different industries, different countries.
It's almost like a global conversation is emerging.
Yeah.
Around what it means to lead with authenticity and vulnerability.
That's pretty exciting.
It is. It's exciting.
It feels like there's a shift happening.
Yeah.
Like people are hungry for a different kind of leadership.
Yeah, I agree.
But as with any popular idea, there are bound to be critiques and counterarguments.
Sure.
I'm curious to explore those a bit further.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, examining those criticisms can help us to really understand the nuances of Brown's work.
Right.
And, its potential limitations.
So let's dive into those counterarguments then.
Okay.
One of the biggest concerns I've heard about this whole vulnerability thing is that it could be easily misinterpreted.
Yeah.
Especially in, traditionally competitive environments.
Right.
Could emphasizing these qualities actually make someone more vulnerable?
Yeah.
To being taken advantage of or passed over for opportunities?
That's a good point. And I think it really underscores the importance of what Brown calls, discernment.
Okay.
Because vulnerability without boundaries can definitely be risky.
Right.
Especially in those kind of cutthroat settings.
Yeah.
It's not about being naive or just throwing caution to the wind.
Right. So it's not vulnerability just for the sake of being vulnerable.
Right.
There has to be a strategic element to it.
Exactly. And Brown talks about this idea of, rumbling with vulnerability.
Right.
Which I think is a much more nuanced way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Than, just sort of being open all the time.
Right.
It's about knowing your audience, understanding the context.
Right.
And being really deliberate about what you choose to share and with whom.
So it's almost like having a filter, knowing when and where vulnerability is appropriate and when it might actually backfire.
Right. And I think that speaks to a broader critique that we sometimes see.
Okay.
Which is that, while Brown's work is very insightful,
yeah,
it can sometimes oversimplify the complexities of leadership.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. And applying it effectively really requires, careful consideration of individual personalities, organizational culture, the specific challenges you're facing,
Yeah, it's not a magic bullet.
Right.
It's a tool that needs to be used thoughtfully.
Exactly. Another critique I've heard is that, this focus on vulnerability can sometimes blur the lines between professional and personal life.
Right, right.
And there's a concern that sharing too much personal information could undermine a leader's authority or, make team members feel uncomfortable.
Right. So how do you strike that balance between being authentic and maintaining those healthy boundaries?
Yeah, I think it comes back to that idea of strategic vulnerability.
Okay.
Being authentic doesn't mean you have to air all your personal laundry.
Right.
It's about being genuine in your interactions, showing empathy, admitting when you make a mistake.
Right.
All without oversharing or creating, an inappropriate level of intimacy.
It's like finding that sweet spot where you're being real and relatable.
Yeah.
But without compromising your professionalism or making people feel like they have to, overshare back.
Right, exactly. And I think it's important to remember that Brown herself emphasizes this too.
Right.
The importance of boundaries and self-awareness.
Yeah.
It's about leading with your whole heart, yes.
Yeah.
But also with your head.
Okay, so after all of this, we've looked at the core message of Dare to Lead.
Yeah.
We've talked about the benefits, the critiques, the need for, applying this carefully.
Yeah.
What's the one key takeaway for our listener who's ready to step into a more courageous leadership style?
I think it really boils down to this. Be willing to challenge those old ideas about what leadership should look like.
Okay.
Embrace vulnerability not as a weakness,
right,
but as a source of strength and connection and ultimately more effective leadership.
But don't just dive in head first.
Exactly.
Be thoughtful, be strategic.
Be aware of the nuances.
Exactly. This has been such a great deep dive. I feel like we really went beyond just summarizing Brown's book.
Yeah.
And we really got to the heart of her message and all the complexities that come with it.
I agree. It's been a really great discussion.
And for you listening out there, we hope that this deep dive has given you a new perspective on what it means to dare to lead in your own life.
Yeah.
Whatever that looks like for you.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's having a difficult conversation or setting a boundary or just taking on a new challenge that pushes you outside your comfort zone.
Because like Brown says, it's in those moments of vulnerability, of daring greatly, that we truly discover our strength and our ability to make a positive impact.
That's a great place to end it. Until next time, keep daring greatly.